Welcome to From the Median, a daily report from the front line of the pro-life movement, discussing two worldviews that are driving our culture in opposite directions. From the Median asks, which side of the road are you on? What direction do you want our culture to go? Tune in as we plan the route that takes us back to the culture of life. And now your host, Molly Smith.
Welcome to From the Median, where we are concerned with the middle ground, not just to understand both sides of an argument, but also to awaken the consciences of those who are neutral or indifferent to this, the greatest civil rights movement of all times, the pro-life movement. This evening we continue our Bringing America Back to Life series. Tonight we will feature a presentation from our 2020 convention. We know that you will be inspired by the ideas, the principles, the experience and the wisdom of our speakers as they join us to pave the way back to life through prayer, action, voting and education. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Alan Keyes, an American conservative political activist, pundit, author, former ambassador to the United Nations, and past presidential candidate for the United States. Ambassador Keyes has unabashedly and consistently raised the standard of inalienable rights and biblical truth in defense of our unborn. He confronts the culture of death with compelling and inspiring reasons why abortion must be banned from our land.
Praise God. Thank you. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you. Praise God. Thank you. I have to say that even though I have spent the last couple of weeks, like a lot of people, I do a little TV program these days, and when you're doing talk, right, you're talking about what's going on and current events and so forth and so on, you do ride the wave of those events a little bit, so you end up talking about what is uppermost in the news. And of course, the crisis of the could-be pandemic involving what I see in my own mind. I honestly have to share this with you. I call it the Wuhan virus, but I know we're forbidden to do that. I still have enough of the ornery American in me that I do it anyway. But but the COVID-19 or whatever they call it, and you can, when you are thinking about the possibilities that face us in such a crisis, you might tend to get discouraged. But I have to thank God for my participation in the pro-life movement, because I have found it to be a source of great positive energy whenever I'm tempted to start thinking of the world in that discouraged way. Because after all is said and done, if after these, what is it now? We're going on 60 million human beings, 62 million human beings. In 1972, how long ago was that? Oh my gosh, I don't even want to pretend that I care to remember. But decades in which we have had to fight the battle for life. And what amazes me is that in spite of all the claimed successes and the obdurate resistance and the effort to turn away from the most fundamental principles on which our nation is based, yet those who have labored in the vineyard of God's truth for the sake of His grand gift and responsibility of life have never retreated, have never foregone their privilege to serve our Lord in this vineyard, and have witnessed now more and more the rising vindication of the truth. We have not labored in vain, and victory is nigh. We have not labored in vain, and though the battle will be hardest now, and the foe more obdurate and ever more shrill and even more violent, yet with our prayers and with our courage intact and with our God on high, we will continue to uplift the truth that makes us not only free, but a nation that has championed that freedom on the basis and in the name of Almighty God. We will not give up. We have not given up. And for his sake and his power, we will triumph in this cause. Because we must. But that imperative is something I think that some would want us to lose sight of. Because they want us to lose sight of our real vocation as a people. They want us to act as if we were called together here by, well, I'm not sure what impulse of selfishness and individual self-aggrandizement, but that may be true for individuals. Came to this once a promising continent full of possibilities for lucre and satisfaction. But you and I both know that if we want to account for the success and prosperity of our country, you have to look at all the folks whose actual aim in the midst of it all wasn't to stash away billions of dollars and begin to enjoy once again the preeminence over their fellow human beings. That was once the hallmark of aristocrats and oligarchs and the few who ruled. For we held out a promise that was for ordinary folks. And I use that word ordinary not in a pejorative way, but in its original sense. The word ordinary actually simply indicates people who are prone more often than not to follow the rules, to go along the path that has been marked out as a path that will be good not only for them, but also for others who are alike by the gift of God entitled to respect for the worth and the dignity, not just of their product and their results, but of their intrinsic worth on account of a heart still capable of loving God and serving God, and therefore sharing the love of God, first with their family, and then with their nation, and thence to all mankind. These were once words of aspiration. But I cannot forego these days to try to remind folks that in spite of our straying, and we have strayed, we need to remember that when push came to shove, and that's all that really matters. You know, you can go back as they're prone to do now. And I've actually, in the last few months, I've been making a conscious effort to revisit a lot of the things I thought I knew about. And that's particularly true of the history of our country and of our founding and of our Constitution and all the struggles and all the debates that took place. And one of the things that still strikes me as it did those many years ago when I first started along the path of those studies was how lofty were the goals of the people who founded the United States. They were not averse to thinking through the challenges of assuring that their communities were going to be strong and prosperous and capable of defending themselves. They were not averse to that. But in the final analysis, they framed the understanding of the standard by which the nation's actions should be judged, its justice should be meted out, its laws should be formed and informed. They raised their eyes to a standard that went beyond their selfish interest, to encompass not just the good of their families and their communities, but a standard of good that had been raised by God from the beginning to be the standard of every human being, to determine the worth of every human life, and to extend to everyone who partakes of God's creation the respect that in the love of God allows all things to work together for good, for those who will follow his ways, obey his laws, and respect his rule. That means that one understanding of freedom that's been very popularized in our country, especially in the latter part of the 20th century, it was as if they took the word freedom and divorced it from everything else, and we were supposed to forget that Freedom is actually not so much a goal as a condition that allows us to make a choice amongst possible goals. Preserving your freedom preserves your opportunity to make a choice. That's all it does. The other side of it, which was emphasized at the beginning, was not freedom, because our founders understood that freedom was just an opportunity, and until that opportunity is exercised in one way or another, freedom is an empty set. You don't know what's in it. You can't love, you can't cherish, you can't respect an empty set. But you must respect the standard that allows you to make that choice in a way that corresponds not just to your own will, and not just to your own goals, and not just to your own hopes and aspirations, but to the higher standard of Almighty God, which determines in the end the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, and gives us the opportunity each time we choose to stand with Him with right, with dignity, with truth. And in a way, and I don't think we often appreciate, that He has called upon us and this generation, these generations when America moved from the conviction of God's truth into the semi-darkness and confusion of that temptation to worship our own will, which mistakes freedom for the end and forgets that the exercise of right can only be assured to those who are willing to respect a standard of right that is not altered by their whims or determined by the goals of their ambition. And the thing that I can't ever neglect to mention, because it now, as I get older, it gives me great satisfaction, even as this struggle grows a little bit more dire, is that, as I said before, we have always, as a people, ended up choosing the right standard and making the right choice according to that standard. I've read a reasonable amount of history, and I don't think any people in the history of the earth has a record as consistent as our own. And we even resisted the temptation, and I always remind people of this, because we never, ever should approach these issues that we're considering tonight without remembering it. Not every nation who dreamt of having the temptation to wipe out all their enemies and bring the world humbly to self-abasement at their feet. Not every nation in the world, in fact, no nation in the world ever had that opportunity until the people of the United States at the end of World War II stood in a world devastated except for us, in which the only hope of lifting it again to decent prosperity was the hope that emanated from a country that had fulfilled Napoleon's dream. He wrote somewhere that he had cannons, he would use cannons. If he had thunderbolts, he would use thunderbolts. And we had the thunderbolt. And we had it for that brief moment all by ourselves, with no one to challenge us, no one to constrain us, no one to keep us from concluding, as every local power had concluded in the history of the world, that in that sign and with that power we could now conquer the earth. What makes me proudest of our country when I think of it is not that we eventually abolished slavery and not that we overcame segregation, but in that moment of earnest temptation, we resisted the temptation of power that every tyrant had dreamt of and would never have foregone. And we not only didn't do it, we didn't even think about doing it. Not as a people, not as a nation. Instead, we held out a hand to those who had been our enemies, and a hope to those who had been our friends, and a promise to those who had been oppressed. And we asked them all to consider the standard of right by which we ourselves were willing to be judged. No nation had ever done it. No nation had ever stuck to it. And we did. And you know, I think that unique choice, which they want us to forget now, they want us to act as if, oh, we were just some terrible, nasty nation going all about the earth doing things to... That's ridiculous. That flies in the face of all the evidence. And we only need the evidence of that moment of supremacy. For whatever else followed, that never did. Whatever else we did, rightly, wrongly, we resisted the one temptation that would have dashed the hopes of all of humankind, realizing the dream of the evil that we had conquered, to establish a rule, a Reich that would have lasted for 1,000 years, because every voice opposing it could have been stilled by our thunder and destroyed by the fire we refused to make use of, except in the one moment when it offered the greatest promise to end war and bring peace in its wake. Why are we forgetting ourselves? We're forgetting ourselves because we're allowing people to get away with lying about who we are. And we're letting them get away with lying about who we are, even though everywhere I go and every time I speak anywhere, I am reminded of the fact that what was, in a way, in the beginning, a far-fetched dream, has actually come true in the United States. And it's as if there is this strong spirit of resentment against that truth, tempting us now to ignore what we have accomplished, even though everywhere we go, we can look upon a reality that was only expressed as a kind of abstract hope in the beginning. Why did they stop speaking in the name that was there in the pamphlets at the beginning of what became the American Revolutionary period? In those early pamphlets, they always spoke of the rights of Englishmen. And they traced everything to the Magna Carta and so forth and so on, and demanded that they should be treated as that instrument fashioned for that people. But by the time the Declaration of Independence was written, they had raised their sights to a higher authority and answered the call of a higher goal. That higher authority was the authority of God. And that higher goal was to fulfill the goodwill of his promise of a day of salvation for all humankind. Why are we letting them induce us to forget that, yes, was that lofty goal pronounced by people who were nowhere near achieving it yet? The fact that they had the temerity to set it as their goal when they were nowhere near achieving it should actually encourage our admiration, not our contempt. I find myself aghast at the hubris of those who in our day will invite us to look back at the founders. Those racists, we shouldn't listen to a word they say. They were racist. They had slaves. They didn't free all their slaves. And I say, oh, well and good. Do you know why I admire the founders? Even though they didn't free my ancestors? Even though decade upon decade followed in which they were continually oppressed, deprived of education, their promise thwarted, and their justice denied, why would I still admire the American founders? Because they're so much better than the generation in which we live. In this generation, they are not content to extinguish the hope of one race or that race or the other race. Their drive is to extinguish the hope of all the offspring of humanity and to return us to the understanding that once you had the power that put weaker people in your possession and made them, as it were, your instruments and belongings, you should celebrate the right to extinguish their lives, as if that is the fulfillment of our greatest human ambition. I rather admire those who articulated the true standard of justice as they failed to meet it, than those who insist on destroying the possibility of justice, not just for one race, but for the whole human race, and abandoning the standard of truth by which this nation raised the banner of that justice. So in generation after generation after generation, people could also raise that banner and call this nation to fulfill that promise of truth. Until time after time, the line was moved, the justice was attained, the hope was raised again and again and again, which today they deny in the womb, not just to one race, but to all the human race. I rather admire those who, racist as they might have been, yet lifted up the standard of God that condemned their racism, than to have to live under the edicts of those who, raising up the standard of murder and death, seek to impose by their power that standard so that it will extinguish in the end the heart and hope of all humanity. This is what is at stake in our battle. It is not just the cause of helpless infancy. It is the cause of all helpless and powerless and hopeless humanity, which has been raised not by our goodwill, but by the goodwill of God, and which is being denied in the very standard of truth by those who now champion the extinction of humanity in the womb. I rather admire those who are racist than those who practice the most thoroughgoing racism of all, anti-human racism. And we must tolerate it no longer. We must bring it to an end. But how are we going to do this, though? Everybody, not everybody, but so many people I meet now, they try to convince us, they're trying to convince us that because we've come so long down this road, we have no choice but to continue walking. Because, well, you know, so many people are now implicated and so many things have now been done. That's where our Christian ethos must come back into play. You see? It is so important. And yet, I have to allude to this, though it pains me greatly even to think of it. It is not a coincidence, I don't believe, that in this time when we are moving toward the fulfillment of God's will for truth, when our science and all those other things that reflect our capacity to understand what we are enduring, all of them point to the truth of the standard in the name of which we have fought for life. Why is it that in this moment we have people coming forward, even at the highest levels of all the denominations and churches of Christ and so forth, including, sadly, my own Roman Catholic Church, And they're trying to convince us that this is not the time to be telling the truth. This is not the time to be pointing out the facts. Excuse me? So now that we can be reasonably certain that the facts now back up what we knew by our spirit and by the word and will and example of our God and our Savior was the truth. But now that our human science has come along and finally uncovered the truth, that from the moment of conception, not just in the womb, but in the mind of Almighty God, our humanity was freed from the shadow of death until we make the choice that reintroduces it into the world. What God means to relieve, we are perpetuating, even as, time and again, the truth that what was once our much revered, you know how they used to always try to argue that science made God superfluous. You remember that, right? God is dead, Nietzsche said. And at the end of the day, though, it turns out that science hasn't been the enemy of truth. Even though now they are trying to turn it into a bastion of lies. When its integrity is respected, it has lo and behold come to conclusions that pretty much affirm the simple common sense that was there in the Bible. Male and female, he created them. Oh, they can't stand to be reminded of that. We got to expunge that from the scripture. What's that doing in there? Well, I have a good friend. He was a good friend of mine. We went to school together. He was my buddy. And I woke up one day and decided he was a woman instead of a man. And now I'm forced to call him Madam. Really? Are we forced to do that? Is that an enforceable whim? See, I know I'm supposed to say it is, but I can't see the logic of it myself. And yet, though the standard of factual truth is against that conclusion, we're supposed to honor it. And I find myself wondering all the time how we're going to handle some of the implications of that, because if thinking does make it so, then the fellow who committed a murder 5 years ago and only got caught for it last year, and who had in the meanwhile decided somewhere in the middle of the morning that he was going to be a woman instead of a man, the jury's going to come in and they're going to find the prosecution showing all this evidence that a man committed the crime, and they won't by law be allowed to recognize that a woman is actually that man. What are you going to do? We need to find the defendant guilty on the evidence, but we can't call the defendant what the defendant claims to what is in the eyes of science, because in the eyes of the law, we must avow that that's a woman sitting there. And if that's a woman sitting there, then that woman can't be the man who committed the crime. I know that sounds a little bit absurd. It is simply meant to illustrate what happens when the one standard of fact that was a common ground that we all agreed on is being discarded in the names of whims that we cannot agree on without destroying the very idea that makes us a nation. Do you see that connection? Because people don't see it. They don't see it. They don't understand that if we are grounded on a premise of equality that makes no sense except in the presence and by the authority of God, we cannot sustain a regime that is supposed to act according to that standard of equality. It will disappear. And what's on offer to replace it has already proven that necessity. Because Bernie Sanders notwithstanding, admirer of Stalin though he was, There's not an example of an individual like himself who comes forward making all this wonderful promises about the free thises and that's that they're going to give us for nothing and the great future that they are going to find for everybody equally. And yet you look at the reality of socialist and communist regimes and the premise of equality was not respected in any one of them. Rather, what was reintroduced was the same premise of inequality that put one party in charge of the destiny of whole nations and consigned everybody else to obey their will. Do we really want to trade our country in for those countries, our system in for that system, our liberty in terms of the authority of God for an enslavement that cries equality and practices radical inequality, imposing death by fiat because they have the power to do so? You understand? How can we do this when we have lived, even just recently? The one thing that I think the advent of this coronavirus illustrated was the difference between living in China and living in the United States. I think I'd rather live here. Okay. I'd rather live in a country where, first of all, we have the right to demand truth from our government. I know you have a lot of people in there now who have forgotten that. But I don't want to get partisan here, and I suppose in the presence of that nice letter from the president, I can say a word or two, and that's nice about him, can I? Y'all wouldn't mind, I think. Because at the end of the day, we are living in a country where he seems quite unwilling to suggest that we shall abandon the standard of rights, individual rights that must be respected because they are enjoined by and respect the authority of God, that we shall let fear of death lead us to surrender those rights as we battle whatever dangers we must face in this world. See? No, he's not calling us to abandon our identity for the sake of our survival. For he understands that if our identity is lost as it stands on the ground of God, then what is it exactly that survives? Certainly not our humanity. Certainly not our dignity. Certainly not our worth. Certainly not our ability to offer to God by our practice of righteousness the recompense that is due for his gift of life in a nation that respects the opportunities for decent life, held out by respect for those who are willing to love God and therefore walk in the paths of his righteousness. Are we really going to give that up now? For the sake of what? False promises that are aimed at doing only one thing: disintegrating us so that we can be forced together again by the forces that mean to restore that form of government which has no respect for our common humanity and never did. That's not progress. I think one of the things we ought to avow if we are serious about our commitment to the Constitution and the Declaration of Understanding underlying it is that we should forbid ourselves to apply the word progressive to anyone who advocates the abandonment of God's standard of equality. There can be no progress if that progress turns our back on that promise of equal justice for all. And there can be no equal justice for all in an understanding of government that in the end, for Marx and everybody else who espouses it, is all about the gathering of power in the hands of a few so that they can determine the fate of all. This doesn't make sense. So, racist slaveholders, though some of them may have been, I opt to respect the standard of truth they raised that condemned their slavery, even as it condemns the new forms of slavery being offered us with lies today. And what we are gathered here to fight is, I think, the great epitome, the great place at which the truth of those lies is most revealed. If you really have the good of humanity in mind, what earthly good are you hoping to achieve by hardening the hearts of mothers against their children? See? Now, how many of you believe that families are held together by fatherly love? Okay, I would like a show of hands. How many of you believe that families are held together by the mother's love? Okay. At the end of the day, y'all, if you turn the fathers away from the children and the hearts of the mothers away from the children, what family do you have left? What care do you have left? What hope for preserving the hopes of those children, as well as their material well-being, do you have left? Let's leave it to the tender mercy of the bureaucracies that have been doing such a great job of caring for people. You know, and I'll say that even about our own. Tender as they're supposed to be in the face of our rights, they don't do a very good job of raising our children. And that is proven by the fact that one of the greatest challenges we're going to face over the course of the next 20 or 40 years, if we survive as such, is the damage that has been done to oncoming generations by the bureaucratic failures of an education system that has abandoned the premise of our liberty, the premise of our justice, the premise of our hope as one nation under God. How are we going to change the result of that? By killing our children and telling the people who should be the loving parents, the mothers and fathers and caregivers of those children, that instead we respect the identity of their preferences for pleasure, their preferences for power, their preferences for satisfying their personal ambitions above God's will, that in the course of satisfying our own preservation, we must see to the preservation of all humanity. That's the beauty of the way he invites us to participate in procreation, don't you think? That it is to be approached, but not so much as simply a choice, but a choice between the righteousness that puts us again in touch with our humanity and the righteousness that abandons that humanity for the sake of our own ambition. And you can listen to all the folks who've written to the contrary if you like, but my reading of history suggests that when push comes to shove, in those moments when the heart of humanity needed to be most clearly reminded of the love and tenderness that ought to characterize first our responsibility for our children and then our obligations to one another on the whole. The voices raised, the tears shed, the reminders given, the examples set that most moved our hearts to do God's will came in the end from those who were willing to walk the walk of parenting along the path of Jesus Christ, accepting the burden of its labor, though it sometimes led to a cross of pain, so that we could fulfill the promise of God for his greatest gift to us all. And I would have to say from my heart of hearts that, male though I am, I am thankful to God for the mothers who had the heart to set that example when it was being forgotten in the midst of the wild passions even of war, which led too many men to forget what they were fighting for. Are we ready to let ourselves be turned into that kind of nation? Because that's what they're doing. Right? They speak of love, but forget that that first duty of love would come to nothing if mothers rejected the vocation that binds them to preserve their children. If they were to assert in the spirit of our bodies, ourselves, that children are property, the way hammers are property and cars are property and houses are property, to be disposed of at our whim rather than cared for by the will of Almighty God. I don't care what anyone says. I think that that example of duty fulfilled, often without fanfare, often without the respect that it is due, is still the greatest example of God's love for humanity that we as human beings know how to share with one another. We really mean to let them extinguish that example and the heart that makes it possible? Because we're on the way to doing so if we do not wake up now and bring abortion to an end. For abortion is not just an activity that claims a human life. It is the activity that threatens the life of the spirit, which informs the heart with the greatest love of all. And once we have turned our back on it, we may still speak of love, but it will, in the words of the poet, alteration find. And changing from what it should be, it will become, in the end, the enemy of that good, which we are called to perpetuate by God Himself in the miracle of procreation. This is the right choice that we have been fighting for. But I think God has His way of reminding us how important it is. I was thinking about that in the course of all this discussion of possible pandemics and other things like that. What happens to trust when you can no longer trust in love? I don't know. As I see the preparations that are being made, and somebody was telling me the other day that it looks like the government's been buying up a lot of the sort of ready-made meals and other things because they're storing them in some of the places where people would have to go if they were being quarantined, right? Because they needed to be kept monitored and do all of this sort of stuff. But tell me something. If you got into a situation where for economic reasons or other reasons there was a food shortage, and everybody had done their utmost to prepare themselves for dealing with that shortage, what at the end of the day would really be most likely to produce an outcome in which everybody got the benefit of that? A world in which the government promised to care for those who hadn't made the proper preparations? Or a government in which the hearts of everybody was informed by the belief that what we have, we share on account of the love of God that flows through our veins and is expressed in the care we are willing sacrificially to show to others. See, I think the lesson of the loaves and fishes ought to teach us something about what God intends. He intends that we should do the best for our own, and when the crunch comes, make sure we know that our own are all those willing to turn to God in His mercy and beg Him for His help. Because He will surely answer us if we say, "Send me." Wouldn't you rather be a country that relied on that kind of mutual help because we had built a character of love informed by what we become when we learn to care for our children as responsible parents, instead of rejecting them as a burden to be extinguished according to our will. Would be ironic, wouldn't it, if the scourge of abortion, by extinguishing that heart which leads us to share with others for the sake of our community, was so extinguished that we could not survive a threat we more than have the resources to survive, if only we remember how to care. I think it's a devastating thought, but I don't think you ought to go to sleep tonight sure that God hasn't set us on a path to test our willingness to rediscover that capacity in ourselves. For it might be a painful way to relearn who we really are. But for those who are willing to listen for his voice and answer his call, it may be the only reliable way to restore that sense of our vocation that led us to resist the temptations of the thunderbolts and benefit rather than destroy our fellow human beings. I don't know that we can go on doing what we've been doing with our offspring and still be the Americans we're supposed to be. And if we fail to be those Americans, as the unlikely and far-fetched dream is realized amongst us, we will be extinguishing that last best hope. So many died so that we could continue to uphold it before the world. And we do so now, not as this nation or that nation, but as people who have come to represent all the nations and all the tribes and all the ethnic groups that people the earth. Not so that we can impose our way upon them, but so that we can demonstrate the goodness of a way that calls all of them to work as we do, together in spite of the differences, uplifted on account of those differences, to respect the panoply of God's provision for our human betterment, our human progress in the true sense, and our human hope. Are we still the people for whom the vision of that vocation brings tears to our eyes and courage to our hearts, calls us to risk and give our lives for the sake of people we have never met and customs we do not understand, living in the hope that if we can demonstrate the capacity of all to work together, that light which shines through us, which is the light of God, will not be lost on our fellows throughout the world. I think that's who we were intending to be at the end of World War II, when we resisted the temptation of power and offered instead the better temptation of liberty and justice for all. This is God's hope for us. This was his first offer until we departed from the one provision that would have avoided the introduction of the choice of evil. But I wonder, could be that out of all of this, he has it in mind to open up a vista that goes beyond what he thought in the first place, toward what he could see in the last place. For he is the Alpha and the Omega, knowing from the beginning the greater end that we might achieve, even if we first departed from his will, so long as through his mercy, so long as through his love, we answer the call of the one who came to remind us that though we may have erred and bear the burden of that erring. Yet if we return to God, He will fill us again with hope. He will lade us again with promises. He will fulfill us again with happiness beyond our imaginings, beyond even that which first He intended. Like the Father welcoming the errant Son back into the fold. The feast that He shall throw for us. Because we have returned to His will be a greater feast than ever we imagined in the beginning. And a greater peace, and a greater happiness, and a greater glory, and a greater joy. This is the people we are, if we choose to be. A people walking the path, not to the promise of our ambition, not to the glory of ourselves, but to the promise of God's love for us, and to the peace and glory that surpasses all our understanding, so that we may learn that in loving God, we truly become people working together for a good that is not just our own, not even of our own human race, but the good of all creation, which He will continue to share with us, secret by secret, discovery by discovery, if we again learn to think as He does, and feel as He does, and walk as He does, to glorify Himself and all of His creation in the majesty of that fulfillment. What you're called to do this evening is to commit yourself to that vision of our people, to that vision of our human race, and to do so in what is at the end a kind of widow's mite. Whatever you decide to do this evening, I suppose it's going to seem, in the face of this grand crisis, to be little enough. But remember, if you give it with all your heart and with all your hope and a willingness to lay on the line all your livelihood, then however small it may seem in the eyes of the world, it will be greater in the eyes of God.
You've been listening to conservative political analyst and pundit Dr. Alan Keyes, presenter at the 2020 Bringing America Back to Life convention.
From the Median is listener supported. Visit our website, fromthemedian.org, for further information or to make a donation to continue to make this radio program possible. Email us, radionews@fromthemedian.org, or call 440-668-4049. Through our FromTheMedian.org website, you can download this or previous programs for your listening pleasure, or sign up to receive our weekly preview of upcoming guest interviews. Tune in every weeknight at the same time to listen to another great interview on From the Median, as we plan the route that takes us back to the culture of life.
From the Median is brought to you by Cleveland Right to Life. Is brought to you by Cleveland Right to Life. Is brought to you by Cleveland Right to Life. Is brought to you by Cleveland Right to Life. Is brought to you by Cleveland Right to Life. Is brought to you by Cleveland Right to Life.